The number appeared on screen at 7:23 a.m., posted to Truth Social in capital letters that left no room for interpretation. 100%. Not 25%, not 45%. 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods entering the United States if Canada fails to meet a list of demands within 30 days. The Toronto Stock Exchange halted trading within the hour. The Canadian dollar dropped 4 cents against its American counterpart before noon. And in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney convened an emergency session of Cabinet to confront what officials are calling an economic declaration of war. This is no longer pressure. This is an ultimatum designed to break a nation. 100% tariffs represent something qualitatively different from the escalating duties that have characterized the trade conflict until now. Previous tariff levels damaged Canadian industries, disrupted supply chains, and imposed significant costs on both economies. But they left trade functioning, however impaired. Goods still crossed the border. Commerce still occurred. The relationship was strained, but not severed. A 100% tariff is not a tax. It is a wall. It doubles the price of every Canadian product the moment it crosses into American territory. Canadian goods that competed effectively in American markets become instantly uncompetitive. Industries built on cross-border integration face not adjustment, but annihilation. The threat is not to wound the Canadian economy, the threat is to destroy it. To understand the magnitude of what Trump has threatened, consider the structure of Canadian trade. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports flow to the United States. This represents roughly $450 billion annually in goods ranging from crude oil to automobiles to lumber to agricultural products. The Canadian economy is not merely connected to the American market. It is dependent on it in ways that no policy can quickly change. A 100% tariff on this trade would not reduce Canadian exports to America. It would eliminate them. No Canadian product could compete when its price doubles at the border, while American and other foreign alternatives remain unchanged. The exports would stop. The industries producing them would collapse. The workers employed by them would lose their jobs. The communities sustained by them would hollow out. The economic modelling is straightforward, even if the numbers are staggering. Canadian GDP would contract by an estimated 15 to 20% in the first year of full tariff implementation. Unemployment would surge from current levels near 5% to projections exceeding 15%. The Canadian dollar, already weakened by trade tensions, would likely fall below 50 cents against the American dollar, triggering inflation that would compound the misery of job losses with rising prices for imports that Canadians would still need to purchase. These are not speculative scenarios drawn from academic exercises. They are the direct arithmetic consequences of removing 3/4 of a nation's export market overnight. Canada would experience an economic catastrophe exceeding the Great Depression in both depth and speed of onset. The demands accompanying the threat span multiple policy areas. Border security measures that would require Canadian adoption of American immigration enforcement practices. Renegotiation of water-sharing agreements governing the Great Lakes. Pharmaceutical pricing changes that would raise drug costs for Canadian consumers. Energy export commitments that would give American purchasers priority access to Canadian oil and natural gas. Elimination of Canadian cultural protection policies that limit American media market share. Restructuring of dairy supply management systems that American agricultural interests have long opposed. The list reads less like trade negotiation than like terms of surrender. Canada would be required to subordinate domestic policy across multiple domains to American preferences. The autonomy that distinguishes an independent nation from a dependent territory would be functionally eliminated. Canada would retain formal sovereignty while ceding practical control over decisions that affect Canadian lives. Prime Minister Carney addressed the nation within hours of the threat, speaking from the House of Commons in terms that matched the gravity of the moment. "What the American president has proposed is not a trade measure," Carney said. "It is an attempt to coerce a sovereign nation into abandoning its independence. Canada will not comply. Canada cannot comply. We will not be bullied into becoming something less than what we are." The defiance was genuine, but the options are limited. Canada cannot match American economic power. It cannot replace the American market with alternative destinations quickly enough to avoid catastrophic disruption. It cannot sustain a trade war against an adversary with 10 times its economic weight. The asymmetry that made integration with America attractive has become the vulnerability that makes resistance difficult. Canadian retaliatory options exist, but their impact would be modest compared to the damage Canada would absorb. Tariffs on American goods would hurt American exporters, who sell approximately $350 billion annually to Canada. Restrictions on energy exports would disrupt American refineries configured for Canadian crude. Limitations on critical mineral shipments would affect American supply chains for electronics and defense manufacturing. These measures would impose costs on the United States, but they would not fundamentally threaten American economic stability, the way American tariffs threaten Canadian survival. The energy dimension carries particular significance. Canada exports roughly 4 million barrels of oil daily to the United States, primarily heavy crude from the Alberta oil sands. American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were specifically configured to process this oil. Alternative supplies exist, but switching would require time, investment, and acceptance of higher costs. American energy prices would rise. American consumers would pay more at the pump. American industries dependent on petroleum products would face increased input costs. This leverage explains why energy was initially exempted from earlier tariff rounds. The mutual dependency made weaponization costly for both sides. Trump's current threat includes energy in the 100% tariff, suggesting either that the administration has concluded the costs are acceptable or that the threat is designed to secure concessions before implementation. The automotive sector faces perhaps the most complex consequences. North American automobile production operates through supply chains that treat the US-Canada border as a minor logistical detail rather than an economic barrier. Components cross back and forth multiple times during assembly. A vehicle manufactured in Michigan may contain Canadian-made engines, transmissions, electronics, and dozens of smaller parts. A vehicle assembled in Ontario incorporates American components in similar proportions. 100% tariffs would make this integrated production impossible. The cost additions at each border crossing would compound until final vehicle prices became absurd. Manufacturers would be forced to choose which side of the border to locate production, abandoning integrated networks built over decades. The restructuring would take years and cost billions. In the interim, production would collapse and vehicles would become more expensive for consumers in both countries. The big three American automakers have lobbied intensively against tariff escalation. Their supply chains depend on Canadian integration. Their profits depend on cost structures that tariffs would destroy. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have all communicated to the administration that 100% tariffs would devastate their operations. The warnings have apparently not altered the administration's calculations. The agricultural sector shows similar patterns of integration and vulnerability. American farmers sell billions in products to Canadian consumers. Canadian farmers sell billions to American markets. The crops differ somewhat by region and climate, but the trade flows both directions in substantial volumes. American corn, soybeans and produce head north. Canadian wheat, canola and livestock head south. Tariffs would disrupt both flows, raising food prices for consumers in both countries while devastating farming communities on both sides of the border. The lumber situation, already critical, would become catastrophic. Canadian softwood lumber supplies approximately 30% of American consumption. 100% tariffs would not merely raise housing costs, they would create shortages that American mills cannot fill regardless of price. The home building industry would face material constraints that no policy adjustment could quickly resolve. Housing construction would slow or stop. The chronic undersupply of American housing would worsen dramatically. Financial markets have begun pricing in the possibility of implementation. Canadian bank stocks have declined sharply. Canadian real estate investment trusts have fallen as investors anticipate property value declines in a collapsing economy. The Toronto Stock Exchange has experienced its worst month since the 2008 financial crisis. Capital is fleeing Canada for jurisdictions not facing existential trade threats. The Canadian dollar's decline creates its own cascading effects. Canadian consumers and businesses hold substantial debt denominated in American dollars. As the exchange rate moves against them, the real burden of this debt increases. Companies that borrowed in American markets to finance expansion now face debt service costs that may exceed their capacity to pay. The potential for a debt crisis layered on top of a trade crisis adds another dimension of risk. Canadian banks, long considered among the most stable in the world, face stress testing scenarios they never anticipated. Their loan portfolios include extensive exposure to industries that 100% tariffs would devastate. Energy companies, manufacturers, exporters of all kinds, they all carry debt that becomes unserviceable if their markets disappear. Bank of Canada officials have begun preparing emergency liquidity measures while publicly maintaining confidence in system stability. The housing market, already Canada's most significant economic vulnerability, faces multiple simultaneous pressures. Rising interest rates over the past 2 years have strained mortgage holders. Economic uncertainty reduces demand from potential buyers. Currency depreciation makes Canadian real estate cheaper for foreign purchasers, but this provides little support when the economic fundamentals are collapsing. The conditions for a housing market crash are assembling with disturbing speed. Provincial governments face their own calculations. Alberta's economy depends more heavily on energy exports than any other province. The oil sands represent not just an industry, but the foundation of provincial finances. Tariffs that shut down oil exports would trigger a provincial depression exceeding anything in Alberta's history. Provincial leadership has alternated between demanding stronger federal resistance and suggesting that accommodation with Washington might be preferable to economic annihilation. Quebec's manufacturing sector faces similar devastation. Aerospace, aluminum, forestry products all flow substantially to American markets. The province's distinctive economy, built on hydroelectric power and specialized manufacturing, would lose its primary export destination. Political dynamics in Quebec have historically included sovereignty movements that might find new energy if Confederation appears unable to protect provincial interests. Ontario, Canada's industrial heartland, would absorb the largest absolute impact. The province contains the bulk of Canadian automotive manufacturing, significant portions of steel and aluminum production, and diverse manufacturing operations serving American markets. Unemployment in industrial centres like Windsor, Oshawa and Hamilton could reach levels not seen since the Great Depression. British Columbia's forest products industry, already strained by previous tariff rounds, would face extinction. The province's ports, which serve as Canada's gateway to Asian markets, might see increased importance if Canada successfully pivots toward Pacific trade, but this would take years to develop and could not offset near-term devastation. The Atlantic provinces, historically dependent on fishing and resource extraction, would find their American markets closed. The economic marginal position of these provinces, always dependent on federal transfers to maintain services, would become untenable. The human dimension extends beyond economic statistics. Families would lose homes. Communities would lose their economic foundations. Young people would face futures with no prospects in their home country. The social fabric that holds a nation together frays when economic security disappears. Mental health consequences, family breakdowns, substance abuse, all the pathologies of economic despair would surge. Immigration patterns would reverse. Canada has long attracted skilled workers from around the world, including substantial numbers from the United States, seeking quality of life advantages or escaping American political dysfunction. That flow would stop and likely reverse. Canadians with skills marketable in other countries would leave. The brain drain would compound economic damage with human capital flight. The political consequences in Canada remain unpredictable. Carney's government faces an impossible situation with no good options. Resistance risks economic catastrophe. Capitulation risks political annihilation and national humiliation. The middle ground, if one exists, requires finding concessions sufficient to satisfy American demands without surrendering core elements of Canadian sovereignty. The opposition Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre have struggled to articulate a coherent position. Poilievre has criticized the Liberal government's handling of American relations without specifying what he would do differently. He has suggested that previous government policies antagonized Washington without explaining how different policies would produce different American behavior. The political incentive to attack the government conflicts with the absence of any superior alternative. The New Democratic Party has demanded protection for workers and communities without acknowledging the constraints that limit what protection is possible. The Bloc Québécois has emphasized Quebec's particular vulnerabilities without proposing solutions that address them. Canadian politics offers no faction with answers because the situation offers no good answers to be had. International response has combined sympathy for Canada with limited practical support. European Union statements have condemned American economic coercion, while acknowledging that Europe cannot substitute for the American market. Asian trading partners have expressed interest in expanded ties, while recognizing that geographic distance and existing trade patterns limit how quickly diversification can occur. The United Kingdom, supposedly enjoying a special relationship with both the United States and Canada, has attempted to mediate without visible success. Prime Minister's Office communications suggest that London has urged Washington to moderate demands and Ottawa to consider compromises, satisfying neither party and accomplishing nothing. The question of American domestic consequences has received less attention than Canadian impacts, but the effects would be substantial. American consumers would face higher prices for Canadian goods they currently purchase. American industries would face higher costs for Canadian inputs they currently use. American exporters would lose a market worth $350 billion annually. The damage would be asymmetric. Canada would suffer more, but American communities would not escape unscathed. Border communities on the American side depend on cross-border commerce. Detroit's economy intertwines with Windsor's. Buffalo and Niagara Falls share economic ecosystems. Seattle and Vancouver participate in integrated Pacific Northwest commerce. 100% tariffs would devastate these communities along with their Canadian counterparts. American refineries configured for Canadian crude would face feedstock disruptions. American home builders would face lumber shortages. American manufacturers would face supply chain chaos. The integrated North American economy would fracture, and both fragments would function worse than the whole. The administration's apparent indifference to these costs reflects either miscalculation about their magnitude or willingness to accept them as the price of achieving policy objectives. The objectives themselves remain somewhat unclear. If the goal is Canadian capitulation on the stated demands, the tariff threat is the mechanism of coercion. If the goal is Canadian absorption into the United States, the tariff threat creates economic conditions that might make annexation appear attractive to desperate Canadians. If the goal is simply to demonstrate American power, regardless of consequences, the tariff threat accomplishes that demonstration. The timeline creates its own pressure. 30 days provides insufficient time for Canada to implement the sweeping policy changes demanded. It provides insufficient time for negotiation of compromise arrangements. It provides barely sufficient time for Canadian businesses to prepare for devastation they cannot prevent. The deadline appears designed to force immediate capitulation rather than to enable good faith resolution. Canadian officials have indicated they will not meet the demands regardless of consequences. The position reflects both principle and calculation. Capitulation would not guarantee relief, only invite additional demands. A nation that surrenders sovereignty to avoid economic pain finds that surrender does not end the pain, only the ability to resist further impositions. The logic of coercion escalates until nothing remains to coerce. The precedent implications extend beyond Canada. Every nation with economic exposure to the United States is watching. Every nation that trades with America, hosts American investment, or depends on American markets, sees in Canada's situation a preview of their own potential future. The lesson is unmistakable. Economic integration with the United States creates vulnerability that can be exploited without warning and without limit. The response will be diversification. Nations will reduce American exposure where possible. They will build alternative trading relationships. They will develop domestic capacity to reduce import dependence. They will shift reserves away from dollars. They will construct economic architecture that limits American leverage. The process will take years, but the direction is now set. For Canada specifically, the crisis accelerates conversations about fundamental reorientation. Closer ties with Europe through expanded free trade arrangements. Deeper engagement with Asia through Pacific partnerships. Domestic industrial policy to rebuild capacity offshored to the United States over decades of integration. The conversations are preliminary and the timelines are long, but the strategic direction is changing. The 30-day deadline will arrive. If the threat is implemented, the consequences described will unfold with terrible speed. If the threat is withdrawn or modified, the damage already done to the relationship will persist. Trust cannot be rebuilt through the same channels used to destroy it. The continental partnership that served both nations for generations has been revealed as a mechanism of American control rather than mutual benefit. Canada faces its greatest crisis since Confederation. The threat comes not from a foreign adversary, but from the nation Canadians considered their closest friend. The response will define Canada's future for generations. And whatever that future holds, it will not include the comfortable assumption that America can be trusted. The number remains on screen: 100%. The deadline continues to approach, and a nation of 40 million people waits to learn whether their economy will be destroyed to prove a point about who holds power on this continent. The answer was never in doubt. The only question was whether that power would be exercised with restraint or without limit. That question has now been answered, and Canada, along with every other nation watching, must decide how to live in a world where the most powerful country considers restraint a weakness and allies a resource to be exploited. The tariff threat is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in which the old rules no longer apply and the new rules have not yet been written. What emerges from this crisis will shape North American relations for decades. But whatever emerges, it will not resemble what came before. The partnership is over. What replaces it remains to be determined, and the determination will be made not through negotiation between equals, but through the imposition of will by the powerful upon the vulnerable. This is the world Trump has created. Canada is merely the first to experience its full implications.